Good morning. Hello and welcome. I'm Atlantic Council Board Director, Mary Carlin Yates, and it's my pleasure today to open this event. It serves as the latest installment of the Africa Center's Africa Conversation series. And this is a series of conversations with U.S. officials moderated by our new and dynamic Africa Center leader, Ambassador Rami Yad. I was delighted to see this series launched on Africa Day with, of course, my good friend and colleague, former colleague, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, and with Dana Banks, who is the National Security Council Senior Director for Africa, one of my old jobs. But I am equally delighted today to introduce the featured speaker, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Akunna Cook. And she has a very large portfolio. She oversees the development of U.S. foreign policy for Southern Africa, as well as economic and regional issues like trade, investment, climate, and health, multilateral engagement, democracy, and human rights. That is a plateful, Akunna. And I have to say, as a retired diplomat myself, it's really encouraging to see people like Akunna in positions of prominence in the Biden administration. It's a time that's critical to re-engage with Africa, with the world in general, but with Africa, and also convince other senior US officials of the importance, the strategic importance of Africa. It's sort of a repeated theme of Ambassador Yad's vision that we have to view Africa as a land of opportunity and not through a negative lens as a continent of risk. So shaping this narrative is very important for the Africa Center, and I'm just happy to be part of this, and will do whatever I can. Akunna, I want to say to you, it's been a decade since we worked together when you were Deputy Secretary Steinberg's special assistant. And I won't tell stories of our trip to Juba, but we are so lucky that you have come back to the State Department in this position. And finally, to the audience, we hope you're going to actively engage today, and you can do so by directing your questions through the Zoom feature, the Q&A of the Zoom feature, or by tweeting them to the hashtag African Conversations. And now, without further ado, over to you, Rama.
Thank you, Ambassador Yates. 31 years of foreign service. You were special assistant to the president and senior director to African Affairs at the National Security Council of the White House, former ambassador to Burundi and Ghana, deputy to the commander for civil military activities for the US AFRICOM. What else? Foreign policy advisor to the US European Command, led by General James Jones. Ambassador Mary Yates, like I said, you are a role model for all those, and not only women, who serve at the Foreign Service. Thanks, Ambassador, for the honor and your warm welcome to our special guest, Ms. Akunna Cook. Ms. Cook, you are Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs in the Biden-Harris administration. As you know, Ms. Cook, we are relaunching since 2 months now the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, as mentioned by Ambassador Yates, our African Conversation series, to discuss the priorities of the new US administration to Africa. No doubt that each of our guests have something special. But Ms. Cook, you belong to something more special. You belong to this generation of recent African descent that is making the difference here in the United States. As member of, yes, I can say as member of the French diaspora from Africa that has been struggling so much in France to renew the French elite, I feel literally connections with the American diaspora, the oldest and the newest you represent. And you are the last phase of the American dream as a daughter of Nigerian migrants reaching the top of the US administration. It is something very new and historic in this election. A website even stressed your Igbo origin. With less than 2 months as president, several Nigerian Americans have been similarly appointed by Joe Biden into such key positions as member of his COVID-19 response team, Ms. Okolo, Deputy Secretary at the Treasury Department, Wali Adeyemo, Acting Director of the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, Eno Titi Layo Ebong, etc. My first question is, what is your secret, you Nigerians in the United States? How do you explain the Nigerian success in this country?
Well, first, let me just say thank you to Ambassador Yates for the warm welcome. It is good to see you again leading in such a leadership position at the Atlantic Council after your many years of service. I also want to say to you, Ambassador Yad, it is such a pleasure to be with you this morning. Congratulations to you on the relaunch of the Africa Center and your vision and leadership. You were among the first people to reach out to me when I was appointed. And I recall you saying that you wanted to promote Africa as a land of opportunities and not of risk. And that as Africa grows stronger, the world will benefit. And you had me then. I was all in for whatever I could do to support you and your leadership. So thank you again for having me on today. As a daughter of Nigerian immigrants, I've always known that my life was intertwined with the African continent. My parents came to the US in the 1970s as students. They actually moved back when I was an infant. And so my earliest memories are from living in Nigeria, living in Africa. And beyond that, both of my parents have remained deeply involved and invested in Africa. My father actually still lives there, and my mother has remained an active part of various diaspora organizations. But it really wasn't until I went back to Nigeria for the first time as a college student. I went back to visit my father, and that's when I realized that working on issues of Africa and issues related to people of African descent was my calling. And it has been the North Star of my career ever since. And so, you know, as a daughter of Nigerian immigrants, a member of the African diaspora, I'm pleased to be in a position where I can really work with this administration, the Biden-Harris administration, on its goals of partnering with Africa to meet so many of the challenges facing the U.S. And many African countries.
Thank you, Ms. Cook. And when you hear about Nigeria, in the news, for example, recently about Nigeria Twitter suspension, do you feel more involved?
Well, of course. I mean, given my ties to Nigeria, given the fact that my father lives in Nigeria, I have many relatives in Nigeria, I hear all the time about what's happening there, and of course, care deeply about what's happening. The Twitter suspension was very concerning and remains a source of concern, because a Nigeria that can play a constructive role in Africa and West Africa and the larger and the rest of Africa is really is critical, right? And so seeing any signs of closing of political space, seeing any signs that we are restricting free speech, these are things that are deeply concerning to me as somebody who cares about Africa, but you know, as an American and as somebody who cares about free speech and understands how important having those freedoms here in the United States have been to us, you know, growing and helping to perfect our multiracial democracy, which, you know, is very much a work in progress. But I look at what we've been able to accomplish here and sticking to those values around free speech. And so when I see those kinds of things in Nigeria and elsewhere around the continent, it is very concerning to me.
Yeah, and like you said, when you speak about social media, speak about freedom of speech, you speak about freedom, and when you think about freedom, you think about all kinds of freedom. Let's go to your portfolio directly, because you are not only remarkable for who you are, but also for what you are doing right now. Founder and principal at Drake Road Strategies, executive director of the Black Economic Alliance, former Attorney General Eric's older advisor, and his career at the State Department, right now as Deputy Secretary trade is an important topic of your portfolio. And I have a first question on this. January 1st, 2021, a few months ago, was a historic date. That date, that day, the Africa Free Trade Area officially started. It was not only historic for the African nations that have been, prevented so long from trade between themselves. It is a colonial legacy, but for the world as well. This free trade area is promising more than maybe tomorrow 1 billion future consumers, future clients. Is this, according to you, is this a wishful thinking or something you believe in? How can the United States support this major initiative in order to make it successful?
It is 100% something that I believe in. We support the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA, and because it makes sense. If you can achieve regional integration, it makes it easier to attract the critical trade and investment that Africa needs to develop itself. It makes it easier for the private sector to work with African governments and the private sector when you don't need to negotiate 49 different sets of rules and 49 different sets of markets. One integrated market makes Africa a much more attractive place to do business. And so we want to see it succeed. We want to help in creating a more attractive and less fragmented market for trade and investment. And so to that end, the United States has provided targeted technical assistance to the AFCFTA Secretariat in terms of exchanges and workshops. And we want to be supportive of this initiative and help to contribute to its success with technical advice where we can be helpful. And so, we see Africa's success and sustainable development as key to our own economic success and key, of course, to Africa's economic success, given particularly where we are with this post-COVID recession that both the US and Africa are experiencing. And so we want to look at ways to partner to create climate-friendly trade and secure good livelihoods for both African and American workers. And we know that US companies are already working to seize those opportunities.
Yeah, we know the debate between trade and aid.
Mm-hmm.
Like you mentioned, if Africa wants to be a land of opportunities and not of risk, we have to pivot from aid to trade. Mm-hmm. How can we make it, pivot to trade, not aid?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I mean, there are always, of course, instances where you need some assistance, some traditional development assistance in the wake of disasters and other such things. But frankly, to grow Africa's economic and to realize Africa's economic potential, we do need to substantially increase trade. And there are a few ways that the United States government has been doing that. So first, we just talked about the AFCFTA and really working with Africans to get the kind of technical assistance that's necessary to realize the potential of the AFCFTA. But we've also been, for the last 20 years or so, had the African Growth and Opportunity Act with Africa. Most of you are probably aware that AGOA provides beneficiary countries with duty-free access to US markets for eligible products. And currently 39 African countries are AGOA beneficiaries. And so we've encouraged these AGOA partner countries to take advantage of the program to the fullest extent possible. But we also recognize that as AGOA is set to expire in 2025, that the US government and in partnership with Africans will need to really consider what comes after AGOA. How do we improve AGOA to make sure that the countries that haven't yet been able to take advantage of those benefits are actually able to develop their economies to the point where they can become export ready. And for the countries that have been exporting under AGOA and have been doing so successfully, what is the next step for those countries? So I think that recognizing, of course, that there's no one size fits all to African countries, and that every country is in different areas and sort of different areas of progress as in its own journey towards on trade, we can then create a policy, a trade policy that really is tailored to recognize the unique place that each country is.
Yeah, we can see clearly the efforts of the U.S. administration to be able, to partner in the most efficient way with African economies and so on. Here, I just would like to highlight maybe an issue about debt, because all these efforts could be useless if we don't tackle the roots of the debt. And here, there is a rising debate about the role of international ratings agency that downgrade countries, particularly in this period of COVID-19 impact, and the economies of these nations, they suffer a lot from this policy of downgrading. African governments can call them subjective ratings, a bad rating, tell investors that they should go away. And some countries miss out on potential investment that are worth millions. And those, they pay higher interest rates when borrowing money from international financial markets. And some economists have analyzed agencies' ratings methods and found an important part of them linked to subjective factors. So my question is, because there are rating agencies that are Americans as well, is there an African bias in these agencies? Is it possible to compete with China, for example, on trade when Africa's post-COVID debt load has worsened with notable downgrades by global rating agencies?
Thank you for raising that. It's a complex question, and I'll try to take some of the elements in turn. So one, whether or not there is bias in the rating agencies. I mean, I think we have to be honest and recognize that anytime that there is significant subjectivity in rating, that there will be some bias. We acknowledge that even here in the United States, when we look at the way that consumers are rated and credit ratings here in the United States. And so that there is some bias even in that when we're looking at consumers, particularly when you look at different marginalized communities, et cetera, right? So we know that there must, of course, then be bias when you are looking at countries, and particularly African countries, and the subjectivity that could be introduced into that process. So yes, rating agency reform and looking for ways to make that process more objective is necessary. You also talk a bit about some of the effects of COVID-19 and what we are seeing. And, I mentioned earlier that for the first time in about 25 years, African countries have gone into recession. And this is really significant when you think about the gains that we have made in pulling so many Africans out of poverty over the last 20 years. And now we're seeing some of this backsliding. And some of that is, the United States is working on this and working with the G20 to provide debt relief through the Debt Service Suspension Initiative and the Common Framework. And the initiative is allowing low-income countries affected by COVID-19 economic crisis to suspend debt service payments owed to official bilateral creditors until the end of this year. And so, as we see that, for instance, China has become a large lender to African countries, and many large borrowers from China are struggling with debt sustainability. We're concerned about this, and so we're calling for greater transparency, including on loans from China, because transparency limits corruption and it allows the international financial institutions to work more efficiently with host countries and allows for faster resolutions of distress situations.
Okay, you absolutely right. I'm sure you heard about the Paris meeting on financing African economies in the past days. And there will be soon in October, I think, a France-Afrique summit, a China-Africa summit in 2022. Japan-Africa Summit in 2022, a Russia-Africa Summit in 2022. I don't know what will happen in 2022, but does this administration plan to organize an America-Africa Summit as well and invite the 55 African heads of state to participate here in Washington, D.C.?
Well, to your question, what's happening in 2022, I think we are all hopeful that by 2022 we can go back to in-person gatherings, and which is incredibly important for summits. I'll also say that I'm not going to make any news here on this webinar. I think that when President Biden, Vice President Harris have an announcement to make about their plans for an African summit, I will let them make that announcement. But I think the question you're getting at is about U.S. engagement with Africa and whether this administration plans to really plus up its engagement. And what I will say is that all indications, certainly here at the State Department and what we're hearing from the White House, is that you're going to see more robust engagement than what we have seen with Africa over the past couple of years. For the past few years, Africa's really been neglected. And the past administration certainly did not make the kinds of investments that we would have liked to see in terms of its engagement with Africa. And so the Biden-Harris administration is looking at ways to increase our engagement, and that includes in-person travel. Of course, it includes different kinds of engagement, including summits, including bilateral and multilateral engagement. And so I think that you will see a real robust turnaround in the way that we engage Africans, because ultimately we have to get to a place where we see Africans as partners. And I mentioned that we are at a place right now in the United States where we're facing many challenges that we share with our African partners. Of course, we have COVID-19, and so it's incredibly important that we engage on health to ensure that we can come out of this crisis, but prevent future crises and pandemics on the continent. We are facing this climate crisis, and Africa is going to be a critical partner in ensuring that we get to the kind of green future that we see for ourselves and the planet. We're facing a democracy and human rights crisis here in the United States and a governance crisis, and that is an area that we can partner with Africans on. And so, and of course, there's the economic crisis, which we just talked about. And so in order to meet these challenges and partner with Africans, we have to engage. And so I think you're going to start to see more of that.
Yes. And there are so many topics we could talk about during this, period of new American engagement to Africa. So we are looking forward to it. But since we are still in trade and commercial issues, maybe I could ask our guest, Lauren Kwasi Olson, to engage the conversation with you about the promotion of business and new partners, new African partners. Lauren Kwasi Olson is the founder and CEO of Birimian Ventures, the first operational investment firm dedicated to connecting Africa luxury and heritage fashion brands with international investors. So we are going to see in a very concrete way, Ms. Cook, what this African business landscape is through her testimony. And she's a seasoned executive in the African financial services and private equity industries and has a question on US-African partnership. Lauren, it's up to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ramayat, and thank you so much, Ambassador Cook. I think I represent a new generation of African, who have been having worked and studied in between the continent and internationally. And today, as a business executive, what I'm doing is really making sure that African companies have access to capital, connecting international investors to local companies. So concretely speaking, what we need is really not aid, but investment, exposure, new form of partnership. As Ambassador Ramayat says, France is very involved, in that relationship and is trying to take the lead on the new African deal. What's the US government views and strategy on this? Because as the new generation, we don't want to be captive of anyone, but we just want to build long-term sustainable and mutually beneficial partnership. So we're here to help, we're here to support. How can we do it concretely? And how can we be instrumental in the US government strategy for our continent?
Thank you, Ms. Olsen. It's a fantastic question and one that I'm really excited about because you're raising a few topics here that really speak to the potential of Africa, right? So one, you're talking about a new generation. Africa is a young continent. The median age on the continent is 19 years old, and young Africans are not only calling for reform and democratization and improved governance, they're also a tremendous force for change and growth, particularly when you think about entrepreneurs like yourself. And so we are here in the United States government working on a number of partnerships, and I'll tell you about a few of them. So first, we have the Young African Leaders, the Mandela Washington Fellowship Program, which is a network of 24,000 young Africans who have developed their leadership skills and networking with colleagues from across the continent. We also have the Yali Network, which provides online training and resources to more than 700,000 members. We have a number of partnerships, including the University Partnerships Initiative that also focuses on deepening institutional relationships and strengthening ties between Africans and Americans. You spoke a bit about the entrepreneurial sector, and it is something that we are excited about because we've long recognized that one of the strengths of the United States is the fact that we have diaspora communities from across pretty much every country in the world and every country in Africa. You have diaspora communities here in the United States. And oftentimes what we see is that members of the diaspora community, I talked a bit about my own family. We have these ties back to the continent, and where, there's a willingness to, because of those ties, there's a willingness to go and invest. There's a willingness to create those business opportunities and links. And there's a vision for Africa that is very much opportunity oriented and sees the future of what Africa can be. And so we're very much making diaspora engagement a key part of our economic engagement and making sure that we are providing the kinds of tools to the diaspora-owned businesses, including through the Prosper Africa initiative, to ensure that diaspora-owned businesses, diaspora investors have the tools they need from the U.S. government to invest and trade successfully with Africa.
Yeah, very interesting, Ms. Cook. Thank you, Lauren, for your fantastic question. Since Lauren is in creative industries, I just would like to jump in to have a brief exchange on this, Ms. Cook. As you know, African Union has prioritized culture and creative industries in 2021. Fashion, films, visual arts, cultural sites, media design, video games, music, and even sports. Africa is right now experiencing an exceptional cultural revolution thanks to a very dynamic youth and the important tech revolution, the most important in the world. And my belief is that culture is the African soft power. And you know that with Nollywood, for example, when Nigeria decided to incorporate Nollywood in its GDP, it became the first economy in Africa in 2016. So so many jobs generated through Nollywood, and it is the symbol of this cultural revolution. But only in whole Africa, it's only 1% of public investment. How can, according to you, Ms. Cook, how can creative industries play a role in African development, or maybe in African leadership?
So while we want to support several sectors, I will reveal my bias and say that I am most excited about the potential of the creative industries. Yes, because I'm a big fan of Nollywood and Afro beats and so much of the creative products that come out of Africa, but also because I've seen the potential of the creative industries to transform economies here in the United States. I think some of your audience may know that the state of Georgia, and particularly Atlanta, has recently eclipsed Hollywood as being the film center here in the United States. And that actually has happened in the last 10 to 12 years because of some deliberate investments and public policy decisions that the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta made to invest into its film industry. And now you see that Georgia's film industry is essentially, has eclipsed Hollywood, but it's also a significant driver of jobs and Georgia's economy. So there's no reason that we can't see that happening, not just in Nigeria, but in many parts of Africa, where we have the kind of dynamism, the kind of ingenuity and creativity. And it's also something that links Africans around the world, the entire diaspora, in terms of a common culture. And so I welcomed the AU's focus on culture and the arts this year. I think that there's a tremendous opportunity there. And, we're looking at ways to support that, including through exchanges between Africa and the United States.
Yeah, and thank you, Ms. Cook. And I don't know if you watched the Basketball Africa League in Kigali a few days ago. It was a fantastic moment for the NBA to launch the NBA Africa. And I would like to say hello to our friend Amadou Gallo Fall, who is the head of all this. And congrats for the successful league he had launched there in Africa. But yeah, we have an African soft power and the American soft power on sports, and that was that is exactly what you were saying. Now, after the entertainment, but we know that the creative industry is more than entertainment. It's a market as well, and a universal message. I would like to maybe we usually say that Africa is a land of opportunities, right? No doubt, but there are a few risks sometimes, and I would like to cede the floor to one of our major Africa Centers experts to talk about the democratic stakes on the African continent. Dr. Pierre Englebert is a senior fellow with the Africa Center and professor of international relations at Pomona College, as well as the coordinator of Pomona's African Politics Lab. He provides expert commentary for the center on the Sahel and has a question about democracy on the continent. Yeah, it's up to you.
Thank you, Rama. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to meet you, Ms. Cook, and I want to thank you for your service to begin with. And I'm very happy to be on this program with you. Like Rama said, I don't want to rain on the opportunity parade, but I do want to stress some issues, particularly with the erosion of democracy on the continent, and ask you what the Biden administration is thinking about doing about some of these things. Particularly, I don't want to talk about the easy case like a coup in Mali. It's easy to condemn obvious reversals, but there's a more insidious pattern of reversal where you see regimes or incumbents play by the letter of the law, but really undermine the spirit of democracy, particularly with the third term issue and changing the rules of the game. And recently we saw it happen with Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire, Conté in Guinea, similar things happening in Benin with Talon. And those are countries where you see, the danger from the Sahel is starting to spread, and part of that might be fed by the grievances of people who feel like they access to the state, that the state has been monopolized and confiscated by an incumbent elite. And so I was wondering, those are kind of nuanced, difficult, complex cases. What can we do? What can the US do in cases like this to essentially make sure that Africa remains a place of opportunity for the next generation, for opponents, for society in general, as opposed to having the states be confiscated by an elite?
Dr. Engelbert, thank you for that question. Yes, Africa is a place of tremendous opportunity, but none of that can happen without peace and security and without democracy and democratic institutions, which ensure that we have the kinds of peace and security, but also the environments where that opportunity can take root and flourish, right? And so I'm reminded that the United States itself is also dealing with challenges with democratic institutions and democratic backsliding. It is an issue that we see around the world. And so it is a key domestic priority and also a foreign policy priority. Here in the United States, whether it be dealing with issues of racial equality and justice, and how those issues have helped to undermine our own democracy. It's also an issue that we see around the world, right? And so I know that this administration is engaging actively with African governments to ensure that all of us who share these values around democracy and governance and human rights in our foreign policy, that we are supporting each other in making sure that we get back to that we reverse the backsliding that we've seen around democracy. The African continent has made a lot of important gains on democracy and institution building, but those gains are fragile. We've seen the backsliding that you've described, and we know that there are significant challenges ahead. And so to really engage, I think we're doing a couple things. So first is recognizing that our own democracy has been tested throughout our history, and that we must, in partnership with other countries that share our values, shore up our own democracy. I think it's also important that we utilize assistance programs that aim to strengthen governance and institutions to protect the gains that we have seen across the continent and prevent further democratic backsliding. I think you're going to see in this administration a real emphasis on working with our partners in a way that recognizes the leadership role that the United States has played on democracy and in developing and trying to perfect its own multiracial democracy, with the humility of understanding that we've got our own challenges, and that we can work in partnership with African countries and countries really around the world. The last thing I will say is that we're going to be elevating the rights of women and young people, vulnerable populations, including sexual minorities, to ensure that they have a voice in their governments and that they are also getting the respect for their human rights and are able to then contribute to advocating for accountability. We'll be working with civil society to ensure that our engagement is not just with governments, but with the people who are affected by these policies across the African continent.
Thank you, Ms. Cook. There are a few important questions linked to just what your exchange about democracy, and I think it's important to take a while on this. We have in the audience a question from the former Zimbabwean Minister of Finance, Tendai Biti. He is raising a remark about the Southern African region. He says that region has become very, very toxic. with trouble spots in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Tanzania, under former president, Uganda, Mozambique, etc. And he's saying that the Trump presidency ignored that region and asked what will be the approach of the Biden administration and what message do you have for human rights defenders in these countries?
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Beatty, for that great question. I mentioned earlier in my remarks that across the African continent, we had seen a decreased level of engagement. And frankly, we've never quite seen the level of engagement that I would like and that many Africa watchers would like to see on the continent. And so engaging across all of Africa to not only focus on the hotspots where where we're in crisis, but also to focus on the parts of Africa where we see progress and where we want to recognize that progress, and also sort of the neglected middle countries that aren't runaway superstars but are also not in the midst of crisis, but where we have the opportunity to strengthen and support those leaders to ensure that they can consolidate the gains that they're seeing in their countries. So again, I think that many countries, and including in Southern Africa, are facing challenges, the same kinds of challenges and democratic backsliding that we see around the world. And so a key and critical part of our policy is going to be to increase our engagement and to ensure that we are using and leveraging the tools that we have to work with those countries and to work with those people and civil society to help to consolidate the gains that we have seen on democracy and to help to influence the countries where we can to get on the right path.
Yeah, and to strengthen this point, Ms. Cook, you mentioned earlier the vulnerable populations, and we know that in this region there are vulnerable populations, and among them the LGBT rights. In this moment, these months very specific dedicated to LGBT rights. I think it's important to ask you a question from our audience. John Mark Gladstone, who is asking, African leaders often push back when we talk about that issue. Is our or your current approach effective? And if it isn't, how should you be engaging Africa on this human rights issue in a more effective way?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, especially this month during Pride Month. We see the respect for human rights to very much include respect for members of the LGBTQI community. And so, yes, sometimes we get some pushback from African governments that question whether or not we are trying to impose something on them that may not be part of their cultures. And I think that the pushback has to be the fact that we recognize that human rights are universal. They're not cultural. They're not human. Some human rights are not part of some cultures and not others. Respect for human rights is universal. And so we have found that engaging and not sort of retreating from our position and our insistence that all people must have their rights respected, and whether that includes women, whether that includes young people, whether that includes members of the LGBTI community, whether that includes members of the disabled community, all human beings have these rights that have to be respected. And so we continue to push African governments to recognize that this is an important value for the United States, but more importantly, it's an important value for the people that live in these countries that are looking to have these rights respected. And so we will continue to stand tall as allies for members of our societies and members of these societies who are looking to their governments to really be much more forward-leaning than they have been in terms of recognizing these rights. And I think you're going to see from this administration based on President Biden's executive orders and presidential memoranda on the topic, that we're going to be continue to push for our human rights to be respected in Africa, but around the world, and particularly when it comes to protecting the rights of the LGBTQI community.
Thank you, Ms. Cook. We have in the audience another figure that would like to speak to you. He's a great promoter of the African American relations through his movement. It's Melvin Foot. He is asking a question about the way Africa is seen in America, and you were mentioning earlier the importance of your action, its impact, not only in Africa but in the United States. And his question is: Americans, and by and large, are uninformed, underinformed, or misinformed about African and African development issues and concerns. Melvin Foot is asking, will the Biden-Harris administration support in effort to change the paradigm by hosting, town hall meetings, seminars, workshops, etc., to take African diplomats, Africa-focused NGOs, private sector leaders in cities and towns across the US to speak directly to the American people? Melvin Foot has done a lot with his constituency for Africa, so I think he knows what he's talking about. What do you think, Ms. Cook, about this proposal?
So I think these are all fantastic ideas. Mr. Foot is exactly correct that, our ideas and our conceptions of Africa have been wrong, frankly, either because of media and the way that Africa has been portrayed in public opinion as a place of risk and death, disease, disaster. Those are sort of the things that people associate with Africa, and it's just not right. It is frankly an outdated notions and perceptions of Africa, when we know that Africa is much more dynamic, much more developed, and much more full of the kind of dynamism we've been talking about throughout today. And so part of that, as Mr. Foot is suggesting, has to do with increased engagement. And I think that we are looking at ways to do that. I think the other piece of it, as we were talking about the creative industries, is telling better, fuller, and richer stories about Africa. We're starting to see that. I'm a huge fan of the many programming on Netflix that is being brought about by contemporary creatives. And I recall sort of watching the first of these and seeing, the studio shots they were taking in Africa, the sort of panning of African landscapes, the cities, the hustle and bustle, and thinking, a wider audience needs to see that, Africa is full of bustling cities where, young professionals are going to and from work, and that it's not all, savannah and, safaris and what you might see in popular culture. And so I think that there's a wide variety of ways that we begin to shift Africa in popular opinion, and engagement, of course, is part of that. But so I think is telling better stories about Africa.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Cook. And the same thought is shared by Lauren. Lauren would like to come back to jump in this brief exchange to bring a new thought on this. Lauren.
Thank you very much, Ms. I think it's absolutely important. We will only change the vision on our continent by telling our own story, our own way. And on this, creative industries are critical because it's the way to communicate on our heritage, on our values, on our tradition, on what we nurture the most. And on this, Ambassador Akunna Cook, I would really like to insist on the fact that the US diaspora has an incredible role to play, because this is part of their heritage too. This is part of their story. So they should have the way to contribute to that new relationship. through culture, which is a soft power. And I would really like to ask you for, your commitments to also make sure that that message will resonate with the US diaspora communities. We need it. Alone, we will not be able to do it.
Absolutely. I mean, as a member of the diaspora community and being in a policymaking position, I was sort of speaking to a very receptive audience about the importance of engaging the African diaspora. It's something that we are looking for more effective ways to do, both on policymaking, and so ensuring that the diaspora has the input into our policymaking, but also, to your point, supporting the diaspora in terms of whether as storytellers, whether as investors and business people. There's a hugely important role that the African diaspora has to play. And frankly, it's the traditional definition of diasporas, first or second or maybe even third generation. No, all people that live that are descendants of Africans are part of the diaspora. And we have a large population of such people here in the United States, and creating and building and strengthening those ties is going to be an important part of the agenda.
Yes. And Ms. Cook, we will be there to do this with you, because at the Africa Center, we are launching a huge strategy targeting culture and creative industries on the African continent. And we try to see how the African American community can be involved in this project, because it's not only about a market, it's also about the connections between these diaspora and their roots. And it's important for African people to make this community understand that they have a continent behind them, and through creative industries we can do a lot. Allow me, Mrs. Cook, because I am under pressure, like we only have a few minutes right now, and I wanted to talk about something that is very important. So we are going to come back to trade, if you allow me to do that, and to discuss about a very, very important challenge we have there. About when we speak about trade, we speak about constraints, and among those constraints we have climate change and the green growth, because here, despite the challenging context of global pandemic, Africa is expected to recover from its worst recession in a half a century and reach 3.4% growth in 2021, according to the African Development Bank. Nevertheless, it will take a massive toll on Africa, hitting tourism-dependent economies, oil exporting economies, and other resource-intensive economies the hardest, as well as deepening inequality. So this had a direct negative impact on budgetary balances and debt burdens, of course. But despite this context, during the Climate Leaders Summit of Washington, hosted by President Biden, he urged the world, including African states, to respect climate targets. A continent that contributes so little to global warming stands to be hurt the most by it. And that continent has already done a lot. There is a concern in Africa about those climate targets. How can we make development and the fight against global warming compatible in the African continent?
Thank you for that question. As President Biden's appointment of former Secretary Kerry as the special presidential envoy for climate makes clear, the administration is placing the climate crisis at the center of U.S. foreign policy, diplomacy, and national security. And we need to be clear, climate change is a crisis. We're working to raise global climate ambition, particularly by the major emitter countries, by engaging in climate diplomacy bilaterally and across a wide range of multilateral bodies. In the African context, you note correctly that many African countries are not major emitters. However, they are tremendously. They feel the tremendous impact of climate change in the form of flooding, droughts, and other natural disasters that happen as a result of climate. The other thing to remember is that if we make investments in the United States and Europe and other parts of the world to get to greener technologies and sources of power, but we neglect Africa, we will then be in a situation where 20 to 30 years from now, Africa is the largest emitter of climate of carbon, and then we're not in a position where we've actually seen any progress. And so it's important that we are working with our African partners, our governments, and the private sector to ensure that we all understand that we can actually have a climate-friendly growth, that we actually can make the investments we need now to ensure that as African countries are developing, that they're doing it in a climate smart way, that we can see and encourage the innovation we need on climate to ensure that as they are producing power and as they are industrializing, they're doing it in a way that doesn't undermine the planet's climate goals. Because like many of the issues we are talking about today, you cannot solve climate unilaterally. It has to be all countries working together, all continents, all regions working together to ensure that we are all moving towards the same direction. And I do believe that there is a way to have climate smart growth, and it requires the same kinds of investments we're making here in the United States are the same kinds of investments that we're going to need to make around the world. But I believe it can be done. It is urgent, and we do need Africa at the table working with us to get it done, but I think it can be done.
Yes. Ms. Cook, we have just 3 minutes left, so I would like to give the floor to another person from the audience for a last question. I wanted to avoid that word in this discussion, the word China, because for me, Africa is interesting, is strategic Chinese or not Chinese, But there's a question from Nick Cheng here, who is asking, how concerned is, because it is another constraint or challenge on the path of the US-Africa partnership, how concerned, he's asking, how concerned is the US over Chinese activities in Africa? What alternative is the US providing to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, well, I share your sentiments, Ambassador Yad, because I think that Africa is a strategic partner, whether or not China is there or not. But I also acknowledge that, China is an important strategic competitor for the United States. And so, I don't think that we should look at Africa as a place where we should go and chase China, because by definition, if we're chasing China, we're in the number 2 position. Instead, I think that we should look at Africa, identify the opportunities that exist, the natural strengths that the United States brings to Africa. And we've talked about a couple of those things: our strength, our diaspora, our values, the important trade and investment linkages that we bring to the continent, our soft power, the creative industries, the ingenuity, and the innovation. So many areas where the United States lead. And so I think it really does begin by engaging, by showing up, which this administration is going to do. And then when we're there, building on our natural strengths as the United States to create the kinds of partnerships and the kinds of linkages between ourselves and the African continent that I think are really going to, frankly, outshine what any other country is doing on Africa, because there are natural ties between the US and Africa. And so I believe strongly that by exploiting those opportunities, exploiting those strengths, that we are going to be able to compete with anyone in Africa.
Yeah, I share. Thank you, Ms. Cook. We are coming to the end of our time, unfortunately. So allow me to thank you again, Akunna, for joining us today. Thank you, Ambassador Yates. Thank you, Lauren, Pierre, and our audience. It was a great honor to hear your perspective here, your thoughts. And for one, I'm excited to see how the administration's Africa policy continues to develop at this important juncture. To our audience, thank you for listening and for engaging through your questions. We hope you will stay tuned for the next edition of our African Conversation series. After the White House, after the State Department with Akunna, after the UN, we will turn, I think, to the Congress. So until then, thank you and goodbye.